So the time monster is Notorious. It's a serial which has a reputation for how bad it is. There's a lot here to discuss and most of that won't be good, but this serial is written by the same writing team as The Demons, so how did this serial falter against their last effort? Let's take a look. So where to begin with this serial? This serial contains a lot of ideas which are mostly half-baked, with very little time where those ideas can be fully explored. Perhaps the best place to begin is with the Master, as we're immediately told that he's going to be the villain again, partly due to a dream of the Doctor, and due to the fact that he's being talked about, which only happens in serials he's in. So the Master's scheme in this serial is to use a crystal to summon a creature of immense power, which he can use to rule the universe. If it sounds similar to the Demons, well, that's because it is. There are some differences though, the main one being that the Master uses technological methods to summon the creature, rather than ritualistic, and the serial doesn't stay in one location, instead moving between different places, with there being a short stretch in the TARDIS. So these changes do make the serial feel very different, but the main difference is just the quality of the writing, but we'll come to that. So back on the Master, he pretends to be a scientist, so he can create a device called Tomtit, in order to summon a creature, a chronivore called Kronos, which is some big bird thing which flaps around stupidly, but we'll come back to that. The machine itself has power over time, which allows for it to move objects between rooms, alongside its more common use throughout the serial to put a stop to people by freezing or slowing time, and even pulling things out of the past. This has the potential to be an interesting idea, and when the Master uses it to attack units in episode 3, it gives us some great moments, but it's barely used as anything more than a device to get a single character into the plot. A section of it is used to summon Kronos, but that section is separate from the bit of the machine that affects time, which makes it feel pointless. So the name Tomtit is an acronym for Transmitter of Matter Through Interstitial Time, which is a fair enough acronym, but there's one big problem with it, and that's that it sounds so stupid. That's Tomtit covered really, so let's talk about the Master's assistants, as they are only important in the first half, with these two being Ruth Ingham and Stuart Hyde. So these two characters aren't the most interesting of characters. Stuart is there for comic relief, as he's generally humorous and jokey, which like with the Sea Devils, the humour shows up in some horrible places. Ruth, on the other hand, has the opportunity to be a very interesting character, although her personality tends to revolve a bit too much around sexism, with her being stuck in a man's world. So while this characteristic does have a chance to make a character really annoying, she doesn't quite reach that, which is due to her limited presence and actually being a scientist that seems smart enough to actually justify this point of view. But this characterisation isn't very well used, as it's mostly there for a few lines and the reason for her to use Tomtit without the Master, which was a decision pushed by the presence of Stuart. She does have a strong scientific grasp, but given that the only opportunity she has to use that grasp is while working on the machine made by the Master, it really limits her. Stuart, on the other hand, lacks this scientific strength, as while he is a scientist, that plays second fiddle to the others. He feels far more like an expendable guinea pig, which is definitely how the Master thinks of him. As stated before, he acts mostly as comic relief, which really is misplaced at times. The most notable case of a comedy being misplaced is when he's just been aged into an old man by Kronos, and he's just calm about the situation and saying funny lines, notably asking about his pension, and even if we're meant to interpret this as a coping mechanism, nobody else is taking it very seriously. These two are only present for the first half, but they do really feel underdeveloped for even that stretch of time, as one can't be taken seriously while the other has potential, but there's nothing done with it. There's nobody else really introduced in this stretch who's in any way important outside of the main cast. The middle section of the serial is set entirely in the Doctor and Master's TARDISes, which is definitely unique and something we've only seen before in Edge of Destruction, but not with this dynamic. This gives us some great and terrible back and forth between the two adversaries, as they try to one-up each other while they're trapped. To explain how this happened, the Doctor planned to land his TARDIS in the Master's, but while he was doing this, the Master also ended up inside of his, creating a loop where neither could escape, even though the Master's TARDIS must still be outside of the loop at the same time, as the Master is able to enter it after the loop has been created. Now while the setup itself is quite iffy, the events which follow are good if bizarre, before becoming terrible. So let's talk about how they both ended up in their TARDISes in the first place. So the Master was planning to travel to where the rest of the Kronos crystal was, and so the Doctor planned to follow him by landing his TARDIS inside the Master's. This, as stated before, went wrong, which basically left the plot at a standstill for a section, as they aren't exactly travelling to the location, but at the same time are in motion, which means that the rest of the elements at play can't affect them. During this stretch, the Doctor and the Master try to outwit each other to force the other out of their TARDIS, which mostly comes from the Doctor trying to talk and the Master shutting him up, which does give us a few funny moments, notably when the Doctor is talking to himself and later being forced to talk backwards. But this is all capped off by the Doctor being sent to the vortex by Kronos, which is seemingly his end, until the TARDIS allows him to talk to Jo to tell her about a switch which can bring him back into the TARDIS. So this is so stupid, and I don't get the thinking behind it. Well, yes, like with most cliffhanger resolutions, the event is negated by the resolution, but the fact that it's so out of nowhere, it destroys the serial's sense of stakes. This plot device doesn't ever come up again in the entire show, and I just don't understand who thought this Deus Ex Machina was a good idea. This scene is basically ignored going forwards, with the Master surprised about the Doctor's return, implying that this lever isn't a common feature of TARDISes. So why does the Doctor's have one? So let's move to the last location that the serial takes us to, that being Atlantis. Or, as its full title should be, if it's not lost yet, we know it's going to be by the end of this. So for any of you in the know, you would be aware that Atlantis has already featured in the second Doctor serial, The Underwater Menace, in which it was destroyed, but beyond just that, the entire place had a very different aesthetic. This one leans towards a more Greek style, fitting with the myth, while the other lent more into fish. So this is something which has become a bit of a joke in the decades since, with even Barry Letts himself playing into it. As apart from this being the second appearance of Atlantis in the show, its destruction was mentioned in the previous season during The Demons, which tells a story which differs from both this and the earlier serial. It is definitely odd to see the Doctor return to this location, but it's basically a completely different place. But this accidental retelling of the destruction of Atlantis has one fun quirk, that being that The Underwater Menace was set in the early 70s, meaning that Joe was alive for the destruction of both of the cities, which is quite funny and a bit of a highlight of having the city twice. So on to the actual plot. By this point, the Master is still trying to get the rest of the crystal, and so is trying to take control of Atlantis, basically by putting the moves on Ingrid Pitt. This does actually work, but everything falls apart by the end, leaving him to escape while the city is destroyed. This stretch of the serial is quite boring, and perhaps the most boring because it isn't even so bad it's good. It's just the Doctor and the Master in Atlantis trying to get to the crystal before the other one does. Despite this, the section doesn't have a lot going on in it, as there are a lot of talking scenes where each side is trying to gain the upper hand, and the leader of Atlantis on their side. The tension should be at its highest at this point, but it doesn't feel like there's any. With this section being so dull, there is one thing to note, and that's the battle with the Minotaur, as it's actually quite fun. This sees the Doctor fighting the Minotaur like a bullfighter, which is just entertaining to watch, as there's something happening that isn't just talking. The Minotaur itself is notable for a few reasons, one of which is basically its backstory, as it's interesting. So the Minotaur was a man who asked for strength, and the gods made him into the Minotaur. While it is quite simple, there is an emotional hook to it, as the man was the brother of the King of Atlantis. But this backstory ends up losing that impact after the Minotaur's death, as there isn't a scene where the king grieves it. Now from his point of view, his brother was dead, but I think this would have been interesting to see. Next up I want to talk about the Minotaur's existence, as like with Atlantis, this does go back to another Triton era serial, in this case the Mind Robber, as during that serial there was a Minotaur. But this is only interesting as it was a plot point in that serial that the Minotaur wasn't real, as that was the only reason it could exist in the land of fiction, and why the Doctor could vanquish it. Now yes, like with the Atlantis stuff, I'm not complaining about the bad continuity, as during this era of the show there wasn't really a strict continuity, due to how TV existed back then. But in retrospect, it is interesting to see this creature, which was stated to be a creature of fiction, actually existing within the show's universe. And the final thing I want to talk about with the Minotaur is the actor who played it, that being one David Prowse, or as people may know him, the body of Darth Vader.
Start tearing this ship apart piece by piece until you find those tapes.
So let's wrap things up, which takes us beyond the destruction of Atlantis. During the chaos of the destruction, Joe ends up in the Master's TARDIS and the Doctor gives chase, which leaves him in a position where his only option is to cause a time ram to destroy both TARDISes and stop the Master. Once the time ram occurs, it frees Kronos, but instead of killing everyone, it's revealed that Kronos is in fact a reasonable being, who saves the Doctor and Joe from their destruction and allows them to keep living. Now I actually quite like this twist, as while the Master's scheme has been quite the same as in the Demons, this resolution is completely different, with the being itself being a non-evil entity, by comparison. While in some ways it does have the same problem as the Doctor being saved from the vortex, this works far better as the serial hasn't really gone into what a chronovore is, and so this reveal that it's not a stupid bird, which we were led to believe it was, is cool. On the other hand, this scenario also allows for the Master to escape again, as Kronos was planning to torture him for all eternity, but the Doctor begs for his freedom, and because of this he ends up escaping again. This is definitely a scenario in which the Master escaping feels too forced, and does make the Doctor seem really stupid for letting him be the one walking at the back. So let's talk about the characters, beginning with the unit ones, and the perfect place to start is Yates, as he's barely in the serial. There are really only two scenes with Yates, those being the opening stretch where he's at Unit HQ, and gets out of going to see the demonstration of Tomtit due to his other duties, and then later when he is bringing the convoy to tackle the Master. The opening section sees him at his strongest in the serial, as the convoy scene really makes him feel very stupid. This is due to the convoy being stopped due to it being attacked by people from history, which the Master has brought forwards, and he seems to be very tame despite being shot at. And the only reason I can assume this calmness is if he's assuming that they are historical reenactors, but as they're using live ammunition, his delayed reaction really takes away from him. He then disappears from the serial as the next section takes place in the TARDIS and Atlantis, with only a brief end scene in the present which he is not present for. Benton on the other hand feels very strong. Right from the start we see his more humorous side as he's forced into seeing the Tomtit demonstration despite it being his day off. Then throughout the serial we do get funny moments from him, but the serial instead has a strong focus on him being a very competent soldier. Benton's best scene is undeniably when he outplays the Master, as at one point the Master calls Benton pretending to be the Brigadier and orders him to leave Tomtit unguarded, but Benton is able to see through this due to the Master's gentlemanlike demeanour slipping through, and so Benton sneaks back into the room and catches him off guard. Now ultimately he doesn't keep the Master as his prisoner, but it's great to see Benton Benton being able to outwit the Master like this and nearly capture him. Probably should have just shot him there and then though. I don't think too many people would have minded. Although outside of that, there isn't anything else too notable with him, other than when the serial decides to transform him into a baby for no apparent reason. By this point the stakes don't need to be increased in the present, as Tom Tit has already frozen all the unit soldiers, including the brig, and the Master has left the Earth, with the story moving away from the present day. This adds nothing to the plot, and only ends up making a few opportunities for more out of place jokes. The Brigadier is as strong as ever, although the story doesn't really allow him to do much. Due to the majority of it taking place in places where he doesn't appear, and the lack of a unit presence throughout, there are only a few scenes where he really feels like he's doing anything. It's hard to really judge the Brigadier in this serial, as he's such a non-existent character in the grand scheme of things. But one scene where he does really shine is when he's taking charge of a situation due to the Master being present, and arguing with a man from the Ministry, who is also there to see Tom Tit. Although I do have to note how funny it is that he drags Benton into the story, despite it being his day off. It's one of his funniest moments, but definitely one of his meanest. Poor Benton. Next we have the Master, who's really no different to his other appearances. I think he's better implemented here than he was in the Sea Devils, as he isn't taking away from another creature. There are several scenes where he shines, with there being a general sense of fun coming from Delgado's performance. We of course have him in disguise at the beginning, with him putting on a very silly sounding accent, which Delgado does often, but he really shines in the TARDIS scenes, where he's outwitting the Doctor. There's a real sense of the two having a history, as he knows exactly what he's going to do, and how long it will take for him to realise what's happened. One last thing I want to note about the Master is in the scene in which he pretends to be the Brigadier over the phone, in which he perfectly mimics his voice without any sort of device. While this is definitely stupid, it was the same idea employed long ago in the Celestial Toymaker. This is almost certainly a coincidence, but a strange one to be sure, as now this seems to be an ability both he and the Doctor shares, perhaps even one their entire species can do. On Jo, she is quite mixed here, with her mostly being strong, but with few opportunities to show it until the end. The opening section doesn't really have her doing much, and she kind of fades into the background until the TARDIS confrontation, where there's nobody else to take up screen time. When the Doctor is seemingly dead, she has a strong emotional reaction to it, and there is a bit of a dynamic with the Master, which you can sense has been building in the background of their past few encounters, but this is really the first moment they've had where they've been able to talk one-on-one, although there really isn't much time for it. Her best scene by far is in episode 6 when the Master is trying to escape and Jo tries to stop him, which leads to her being a prisoner of his. While I have mentioned this scene before and how the situation is resolved, what I haven't mentioned is who caused the time ram, as the Doctor isn't able to do so as he doesn't want to risk Jo's life, and so she does it instead. This is a really cool scene, of a companion being the one to give up their own life in order to save the grander universe, and we really haven't seen a scene like this in a while, or at this scale. Now ultimately they do get saved, but Jo's choice here is what makes it such a great scene for her. Finally we have the Doctor, who feels very mixed in this serial, as he often feels a bit too comical. Like with all his serials, there are strong moments for him, but these feel few and far between, due to the sillier scenes. One of the most notorious scenes in this serial has the Doctor making a device which can interfere with the Master's TARDIS and Tom Tit, out of a bunch of random items and is powered by tea leaves. It just baffles me as to who thought it was a good idea, and it feels like a joke that got out of hand. This scene adds nothing to the serial as well, with it being there entirely to pad out the runtime, and does nothing other than take away from the tension. But this serial's one redeeming feature is also a Doctor scene, and it's the scene where the Doctor talks about his homeworld and a hermit monk who lived near his house and taught him to see the universe in a different way. This scene feels entirely out of place for just how good it is, with the Doctor opening up about his home planet in a way we haven't really seen before, and exploring his still very ill-defined past. Now the scene does feel like it's there to pad out the runtime a bit, as it doesn't really add anything to the story itself, but it's so strong that I can't disregard it for that. This is definitely one of the greatest moments of this incarnation. How on earth did it happen in this serial? So with the plot and characters covered, let's talk about the restoration. And this serial is a bit more complex than it first seems. So the serial was mostly restored with reverse standard conversion, but the final episode used a slightly different method, with it combining this method with the colour restoration process, where they combine the image and colour signals from different copies, this leading to a different look for that final part. There aren't really any behind the scenes things I want to discuss with this serial, or nothing that I've ever heard of interest. But the TARDIS is a big thing to talk about, as in this serial it had a new design which only lasted for this one story. This design is terrible, as everyone knows, and doubles for both TARDISes. It's quite ugly looking and ended up being water damaged in storage, and I can't say this is a design I miss, especially with the design that replaced it. Something I have to talk about is the seemingly rushed nature of the script, with it taking inspiration from both the demons with the main idea of the Master wanting to use a godlike being for his gain, alongside the fact that at one point the season was going to be concluded with a Dalek story. This was something I mentioned in my Day of the Daleks review, but this season was originally meant to conclude with the Daleks making their return. Now this of course didn't happen as I explained back then, but it ends up feeling like this decision was made late in the day, and so this script was rushed out as a result. But given there were several months between the production of these two serials, it's unlikely this would have been the case. Either way, how we came to have this serial is just odd given the other works of this writing duo. One final thing to note is that I used to think that this serial was better than The Mutants, as I stated in that review, its conclusion is quite bad, and it impacted my view of the rest of it, but in retrospect, that serial is amazing by comparison, as this fails on basically every level throughout. So in conclusion, The Time Monster is bad, and I mean really bad. There are terrible decisions in terms of how events play out, and it's a bit slow paced. It has some interesting ideas, but some are used better in other serials, or they're not even made to be used as anything more than a one-note thing. Its characters aren't compelling, and even its production seems very slapped together at times, with some very dodgy directional decisions and some very underwhelming cliffhangers. It has one scene which stands out as great, but that's far from enough to save this mess.